Hello, and welcome back to The Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 15 of The Silver Chair, The Disappearance of Jill.
And we needed to bring in a special guest for this one as well.
We do. We have today William...
An expert.
An expert. We have William O'Flaherty. William O'Flaherty is the author of The Misquotable C.S. Lewis. And he's the host of the All About Jack podcast, the creator of EssentialCSLewis.com, and he recently created a YouTube channel called 90 Seconds to Knowing C.S. Lewis. And on top of all of this other Lewis-related work, he's also a mental health counselor who works with families. He's a busy man.
Yeah. Welcome to the show, William. Thanks for making time.
Well, thanks for having me, gentlemen.
Yeah. So we first met you in person about a year and a couple months ago, right?
Yeah, at Montreat, we all got to meet each other.
Yes. Yeah, that was a very good event.
It was. Yeah. Filled with meeting great people and hearing some, what I consider kind of inside stories about the real behind the scenes of how these books were made and what C.S. Lewis was like.
It really was. It was. I think it was really special for Phil and I because it was kind of our first, entry point into the Lewis community outside of this podcast. But for you, William, you've been involved with C.S. Lewis and talking and interviewing scholars and, as an author yourself, you've been doing this for a long time. And we're really excited for you to be on the show and just bring all of your expertise to this episode.
Well, thank you. Yeah, like I say, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to what we're going to discuss here about Chapter 15.
So, William, before we jump into Chapter 15, we have a couple of questions we'd love to ask you just to get to know you a little bit better. And just like we ask all of our guests when they first come onto the show, how did you first encounter the Chronicles of Narnia?
Sure, yeah, great question. Narnia was actually my first introduction to Lewis, which is not uncommon for many people. But for me, it didn't happen until my junior year of high school. It came about from a reading assignment in my English class. Now, I should note that I had been struggling in a different English class and had changed to the one I'm now referring to. Let me briefly explain that. As best my memory remembers, the school I went to had a few levels or degrees of difficulty for English class. That is, in addition to the typical remedial, regular, and honors class. Among the honors English class was a college prep class that you could take, which I had been in. Then there was what was considered a non-college prep class, which I just changed to. And that's where we had an assignment one day to read some books. And so there was a list of books to read. And I looked over it. And as I noted, not being a strong reader, I picked The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe because it was the shortest book on the list.
Good choice.
What did you think about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a junior in high school?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. As I noted, not being a strong reader in the other class that I had, we read one of your more traditional, like, when you're in high school, you read this book or that book or whatever. And I was like dozing off with it, but not with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It was very interesting and exciting.
Well, that's awesome. That's really great. I'm glad that's such a great entry point. I think that's probably my favorite way to introduce Lewis to people is through Wardrobe. Well, speaking of one of the books, William, do you have a favorite chronicle in the series?
Well, since you did tell me in advance this was going to be the question, I have a nice, I hope, somewhat polished answer, but So, well, first I should mention, though, I didn't read any other Narnia book after The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe until it was during my undergraduate days. So this was not until college that I read the rest of it. So I'll have to say, having read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe first and being impressed by it, you could say on one level that was my favorite, among the first readings of it. So then reading the entire series, I would say I would need to change my answer. While I enjoyed all of them, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Silver Chair, and The Last Battle would be a top three. And then to narrow down further, just going on that first reading, ironically, it was The Silver Chair that really stood out most to me at that time period. In fact, there's a favorite quote that stood out that I didn't necessarily remember which book it was from. And since it's actually in the third chapter that you've already read, if you don't mind me reading the short part here from that, this is what stood out to me, and that's why I would consider The Silver Chair as a favorite. It's the end of the chapter 3, the last paragraph. Jill is getting ready to go to bed, and she says, "I bet we sleep well tonight." And then the narration says, "For it had been a full day," which just shows how little anyone knows what is going to happen to them next. So that last sentence stood out to me, which just shows how little anyone knows what is going to happen next. It really stood out to me, which is very true today and any day in our lives.
Yes, I love that quote too. It's so neat that stood out, and I'm glad that we had you on for the silver chair episode. Yeah.
Well, William, you, on top of hosting the All About Jack podcast and being the creator of EssentialCSLewis.com, you've also written a book about C.S. Lewis. You've written actually 2 books about C.S. Lewis. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about one of your books, which is called The Misquotable C.S. Lewis.
Sure. Yeah. Well, in terms of sharing something about it here, let me initially answer that with a quotation that you'll find in my book. Quote, "To quote his human, to quote correctly, divine." Now, who said that? Did C.S. Lewis say it? George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton, Aristotle, St. Augustine, or St. Augustine? I listened to an earlier podcast where you were talking about that. Or actually, that's a made-up quote from me as a tongue-in-cheek way of, kind of introducing the topic. So the title of my book, somewhat clearly suggests what the book is obviously about, but misquotes. Mm-hmm. But the subtitle gives a fuller picture, and my friend Dr. Charlie Starr came up with this subtitle, which is "What He Didn't Say, What He Actually Said, and Why It Matters." So my book explores 75 quotations credited to Lewis. Now, I should add as a side note, since then I've discovered at least 25 more. But technically speaking, though, it's not just about misquotes, but mostly about falsely attributed material to Lewis that he didn't write. And then on the back cover of my book, I distinguish those 3 categories about quotes not by him, almost, which are paraphrases, and then not quite, which would be material that he did write but isolated. The context makes it difficult to really truly know what he's saying.
It's been a book for me that over the last few years, when we first met you last year, I went home and I grabbed a copy of the book, and I was surprised at the time. I thought, we've been doing this podcast for a year or 2 at that point, and I was like, I'm sure that most of these I'm not tricked by. I host a C.S. Lewis podcast, and there was at least 2 or 3 that I thought were by C.S. Lewis, and I opened your book and I was like, oh, he never said that. Or what happened more often was that he would have said it, but it was maybe a word or 2 missing that actually changed the meaning, or the context, like you said, was missing, and so it appears to be saying something that actually he's not saying. And it's been a really helpful book for me.
Well, good. I'm very glad to hear that. As an author, we always like to hear those things.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to know a little bit about what your research process looks like, because it can't be easy necessarily trying to confirm a quote. Like maybe you see some quote on social media and then you're trying to figure out, wait, did Lewis actually say this? I'm not sure where it came from. What does it look like for you to prove if a quote was actually said by Lewis?
Yeah, that's a good question here. Well, now, it's not true maybe for every quote this will be the process, but generally speaking, what I typically actually do is, because I've pretty well with searching and you're trying to dig deeper, so I actually go online and check to see if there are any other authors that have been credited with the quote in question. And that includes, there's a ability to search within Google for books. And so that will let me know, kind of historically who has been credited with this quote. Now, of course, initially when you do a search, you may get the first page and it may all say C.S. Lewis. And you go, okay, well, that's it. No, but if you take the time to look through several ones of those, and there's some other specialty places you can search online, but that'll be my first stop to see if there's someone else that has been possibly credited. And then sometimes I don't have to go any further because I see enough that says, no, it's definitely not Lewis. And then I will usually try to take the time, if it's possible, to know who might have said that. And then while I don't have them all in one single book to search at a time, I do have the text, or we could say, electronic copies of nearly all of Lewis's works. That is, all of them are technically not available, but all of his Christian themes books are. Some of his academic titles are the only ones that are not available that way, but then some quotes that are in question are more like pop psychology, motivational things, which wouldn't typically be in an academic type book. But in his academic books, sometimes he does make some interesting statements that would be more considered, Christian. He's not afraid to do something like that. But those books that I might look through, which I have a digital version of, is The Quotable Lewis. And then there's an older one that came out before that called A Mind Awake, which is a collection of quotes, usually some larger sections. And then a daily reading one, The Business of Heaven. And then more recently, in the last 15, 20 years, Words to Live By is a book. And then A Year with C.S. Lewis, also all these I have electronically. So I'll skim through those and or search through those, not really skim. And then there is a collection of 30 of his titles that is searchable in a Bible software program called Logos that I can also then search. So that's how I'll go about to, verify whether a quote is from Lewis or not.
Wow, that is a very thorough process. I appreciate you doing that work. I also love that the internet has made so much of this stuff possible, because it used to be people would just misquote and there was no way to challenge it or kind of dig through and get to the source. But that's really fun.
Yeah, and then actually, ironically or fortunately, material that I started to write years before my book came out, because that's how it all started. I thought, I'll just kind of do this one at a time. We'll maybe find 15, 20, and then it kept growing. But some of my earlier postings that are online, when you now search for a quote that people want to try to confirm is Lewis or not, you will oftentimes find my posting among the ones that say it is Lewis.
I was actually going to tell the story that one of the I can't remember, one of the first times I was searching for a Lewis quote. This is like 2 or 3 years ago, and we had not met yet. But I was trying to figure out if this was a real Lewis quote. I was like, I don't think he says this. It was something from Screw Tape, actually. And I searched for it, and like the third one down was like how it was your website. It was Essential C.S. Lewis. Proving that this actually wasn't him. And that was the first time I ever felt really good about my Lewis knowledge. I was like, oh, I knew something was up, and William confirmed it. Well, as we talk about Lewis and how often he is misquoted, my question to you, William, as someone who has spent so much time researching this, is why do you think it is that Jack is so often misquoted across the spectrum, whether you're saying it's like this, pop psychology kind of stuff, or just in different kind of Christian circles? He is someone who is quoted incorrectly relatively often, more often than you might think. And why do you think that is?
Well, others have actually written some books about people being misquoted. So some of what I'm about to say is kind of adapted from them. But I would kind of approach it mainly three main ways, and that is Lewis is likely given credit for quotes he didn't write because people want a highly recognizable individual associated with something they enjoy or already agree with. Now, that doesn't mean they see an anonymous quote and they slap Lewis's name on it to share it, but the others that I'm about to say kind of fit into how it happens by mistake. But just the fact that Lewis is a recognizable name, it adds weight to the expression. Because like some of them that I did come across, which are in my book, and then since then, or really just anonymous quotes, and people have associated Lewis with it somewhere along the way. Well, now, another reason he and other authors are wrongly attributed is due to an honest blunder. Someone reads something referenced in a a book and checks the footnote, but notices the name either before or after it without realizing they made the error. Then finally, fake quotes come about because people rely on their memory and end up creating a saying that is a good or bad paraphrase of the actual material.
Yeah, I just ran into this. There was a quote by Mark Twain that I just found out was misattributed, and sometimes it's just easier to remember it kind of rearranged or said a different way, or enough people do it, and it just becomes that becomes the new quote because no one ever like went back to the source to confirm it after a while.
Yeah, there's a book about misquotes in general, and I'm going to say, don't quote me on this, but it's nice guys finish last, but actually the quote is nice guys finish seventh, the original one. So I guess in terms of,
Wow.
in print, I'm not sure how the book is represented, but if you look it up either way, but the actual quote was nice guys finish seventh, but then when someone was remembering it, it became more pithy to say last, and so that's the one that sticks in our minds.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
That's a good yeah. It just shows you just how susceptible we can be to kind of hearing what we want to hear, and we always want Lewis to say what we want him to say. What fits with us, and so we'll, even if it's something that is along the right lines, like you're saying, Phil, we might change a little bit just so it's easier for us to remember, like you're saying with this nice guys finish seventh kind of thing.
Another one of my favorites is when people make up quotes for the Bible and things like "God helps those who help themselves," and you're never gonna find that
Yeah.
Yeah,
in Scripture.
right, exactly. Good example.
Well, William, thank you for sharing a little bit more about what you do and what you have done in this Lewis community. And just before we go ahead and jump into chapter 15, I was just wondering if there's anything else more you wanted to share about your work surrounding Lewis before we move into chapter 15.
Well, I guess I just briefly detail the first book that came out is a study guide to the Screwtape Letters, which many people who enjoy Narnia also find the Screwtape Letters interesting. It's just a single book, 31 letters written from the perspective of a senior demon to his nephew, how to help him to be an effective tempter. And the book can be enjoyed on its own, just like the Narnia stories. But for those who are listening here that want to go deeper within the Narnia stories, then if you ever read the Screwtape Letters, then you'll want to consider my study guide, which tongue-in-cheek, the title is C.S. Lewis Goes to Hell, because the subtitle then is a companion and study guide to the Screwtape Letters. So actually, I was inspired somewhat by the companion to Narnia, which I know you guys have mentioned. And so in addition to going chapter by chapter with questions and some other organizational factors to it, I created a topical guide in terms of our, I guess we called it a topical glossary as I'm looking at my book. I could never remember what the final title was for that section, but any type of theme like prayer, emotion, education, obedience, ownership, then I do an entry about that and share where it may be in some other letters than just the one that you may be noticing. So it's a somewhat versatile book. There's a few different study guides out there. I think mine's the best because I wrote it, but people can examine the different possibilities and then decide for themselves.
They'll just have to go buy your book to double check to see if you're telling the truth or not.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and then I do have. I know you have show notes. We can give them a link to the website, which is screwtapecompanion.com, and in the upper right corner, you can download a 20-page sample of the first part of the book to kind of let people get a taste of it.
Oh, cool. That's awesome. Yeah, we'll have links to a lot of your work there in our show's notes for listeners who are interested in learning more about you and seeing the work that you do, William.
Great.
Well, I think it's time for us to begin chapter 15, the penultimate chapter of The Silver Chair. It's entitled The Disappearance of Jill. But before I give my chapter summary, I want to remind us that in the last episode, Jill, along with Eustace, Puddleglum, and Prince Rillian, tried to escape back to the surface. And we ended on a little bit of a cliffhanger as Jill was getting on top of Puddleglum's shoulders to try to see out of where they were seeing a little bit of light come through as they can seem to be near the top of the surface. I don't need to like spoil it. We all know what happens in this chapter. We're about to read it. But let me go ahead and do my chapter summary. Jill exits the Underland and discovers that they have arrived in the very heart of Narnia. She watches in amazement at the great snow dance, but she's suddenly hit in the face with the snowball. She communicates the situation to the Narnians, and after a bit of confusion, Eustace breaks through to the surface as well. Puddleglum and then Rillian are dug out next. There is much rejoicing over Rillian's rescue. Exhausted but relieved, Jill and Eustace are brought into a nearby cave for warm food and drink.
Well done. I think you really captured the true Narnia spirit. Just the snowball fights, the dancing, and the having some food together.
Yeah.
The feasting.
This reminds me of that scene from the second chapter of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Tumnus is telling Lucy about what Narnia was like before the White Witch's reign. And I don't think we've really just seen a lot of our Narnians just having a good time. Usually when we've met them throughout the first 3 books, and even here in Silver Chair, it's been in the midst of something, dramatic. And so there's not a lot of hanging out and playing and just dancing because the first snow has fallen. So I loved, that was probably my favorite part of this whole chapter, was the joy of the Narnians, just seeing them be Narnians.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm excited to discuss this chapter is it's the resolution of the quest. They found the lost prince, and now they've returned to Narnia. And of course, there's one more chapter after this, but pretty much from this chapter here, they've finished what they were set out to accomplish.
Yeah, it comes full circle, and like Daniel said, it's so fun to see kind of Narnia in good spirits, and things are getting better. The prince is back now.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure this has been brought out before, is that how well Lewis does at showing versus telling. He paints a vivid picture of what is happening in such a way that you literally feel like you're there.
Yeah, for sure. I felt like this one, and everything is so easy to picture, but this one especially, I think because this was kind of recalling other happy scenes in Narnia, and we're now 4 books in if you're reading them in the order that he wrote them, and it really does stand out as like, man, this is so easy to picture, and there's nothing odd about it, even though it's animals dancing and feasting with humans.
There's nothing odd about that to you?
No, not anymore, because we're so used to it.
Yeah, it's a really fun chapter, and it's one of those chapters where really, I mean, if we wanted to be cynical, which we don't want to be on this podcast, we could look at this and say that, well, really back in chapter 12, when the Lady of the Green Kirtle was defeated, all the tension was taken out, and I don't think that's true. I think you could try to argue that, and then just, it's just about them, getting back to the surface. But I think what's really beautiful about the way that this book ends is that we have our 4 companions here leaving with, yes, the great evil having been defeated, but that not be the end of the quest. I think I love that you said that, William, that this is the end of the quest here. The quest wasn't just to defeat her, it was to bring Rillian back to Narnia. And that still hadn't happened until the end of this chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And then the characters, I think, are presented. They're presented very well each of the chapters. But reading this one more than when I reread the whole book, and then I focused in on this in preparation here. But I think I noticed, especially in this chapter, that even though there's other examples in the earlier chapters about like Puddleglum's personality, it's represented very well. Even though he's not a major focus in this chapter, we see Eustace's bravery. He's not he's not a major focus in this chapter either. But then Jill is also presented obviously as brave, as she wasn't quite sure what was going on. At the end of the last chapter, we have the book saying Jill held her tongue, and then the parentheses for the narrating commentary. I'm quoting some more here. If you don't want other people to know how frightened you are, there is always this is a this is always a wise thing to do. It's your voice that gives you away. So from that, when we're getting into this chapter, Jill is feeling pretty frightened, but yet once she realizes what's happening, she has changed, and she was brave enough to take that risk, and then her risk paid off in that they were in Narnia. So I think that's a very good way that Lewis developed the I don't know if you want to say tensions, so to speak, but just shows that even when you are afraid, you can still take appropriate risks, and then trust what might happen.
Right.
Yeah, let's talk more about that. Jill's exit from the Underland into Narnia itself. So the chapter begins with her getting out, and it actually, even though there's a lot of tension, the first couple of paragraphs have quite a bit of humor, because Jill goes through this hole. She disappears through it. She begins to say, "I say," and then you hear like a bunch of muffled talking, and then nothing. She's vanished. And as you mentioned, Puddleglum doesn't really play a large role in this chapter. But man, does he have a great line here. He says, "Oh, I'm born to be a misfit. I shouldn't wonder. Fated to be Pole's death, just as I was fated to eat talking stag at Harfang." He's just so, and this is a serious moment because we don't know what's happened to Jill. And like the prince even says later on, like, this is actually pretty shameful that these three men, or well, one's a boy, but these two men, I guess one's a Marshwiggle. There's one man, one Marshwiggle, and one boy, but they have sent a brave lady into the hands of the enemy, as the prince says. And Puddleglum's response to that is, well, we're not very safe except for death by starvation in this hole. So it does begin with we do get, despite Puddleglum not playing a large role, we do get some of his wonderful character in here.
Yeah. And even later on, we'll see the Narnians say, "Isn't that just like a Marshwiggle?"
Mm-hmm.
And it's fun that this is a well-known trait. It's not just Puddleglum.
I remember reading that part. Is that I didn't realize that was just all Marshwiggles are this way. I thought it was maybe just Puddleglum, but now it's like a.
Well, we didn't want to assume, but now it's being confirmed.
But now we know.
Yeah, well, and actually, earlier in the book, Puddleglum claims that he is he's supposed to be one of the more optimistic Marshwiggles. Right. Anyway. Now, whether that perception is correct per se or not, I'm not sure. But yes, speaking of perception, I might minorly disagree with you, or else maybe point out a larger picture in terms of they're noting about the shame that they sent a lady into the hands of the enemies. Well, this is how they're feeling at the moment because they don't know what's happened to her. But if you carefully read the end of the last chapter and into this, you see it was more of a casual, okay, we don't know where we're at. Oh, okay, I'll go ahead and stand on your shoulders and see what we can do. So it wasn't like they tricked her into it or whatever, but they were feeling bad about it. It's a matter of the perspective at the moment and such, I think, which also bears out in other aspects in this chapter and, of course, in the whole series.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that this is almost them reacting in anxiety to what has happened, the disappearance, and their first thing, like we all can sometimes do when we're stressed, is we kind of just start blaming ourselves, even though they really didn't. It's not like they actually said, "Hey, Jill, go. We're all too afraid." Because they didn't do that at all. Right. But
it's in line with Puddleglum's behavior, and what the prince says is kind of in line with his behavior. It's this slightly overly chivalrous kind of way of talking about it, like, "Oh, look what we've done. We've sent a lady into the unknown."
Well, as Jill, we then get the perspective of Jill of what happened when she disappeared here. We find out that she kind of goes through this hole, as Lewis writes, and realizes that she's seeing stars up ahead. And here, in fact, Lewis points out that she sees moonlight. And now I just wanted to pause for a second because we have not talked a lot about Planet Narnia with the Silver Chair. We've obviously mentioned it, and observant listeners will remember that this book is focused. Actually, before I say this, Phil, I'm going to quiz you. Do you remember what is the heavenly body for this book?
I don't. Is it Saturn?
It's not Saturn. It's the moon. It's
It's the moon.
It's the moon. Yes, which is why I'm bringing up the moonlight here. It's okay. We haven't talked about it for a while, and we've talked a little bit though about how the moon was related to the idea of lunacy during the medieval times, as well as just there's some connections to the moon itself. And here, I think this is just a small one to point out. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's the moon that brings them back, that draws them back to Narnia through that blue light. And William, you are familiar, I am assuming, with Planet Narnia, correct?
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah, I have ultimately now read both of the books. The Narnia Code being the more popular version in terms of approachable. In fact, I had only read that at the time when I actually did a series of interviews with Michael Ward. Actually, I did a single one with him, and then I was able to work out a more detailed but not too lengthy on each chapter from the Narnia Code. So, yeah, very, very interesting book.
That's awesome. How, as someone who has read so much of Lewis and talked to so many scholars, are you bought into this theory?
Well, I mean, I definitely do like it in terms of how it notes some different layers to it that you can appreciate even more, especially again in terms of the Narnia Code. Even though I kind of, or even though I rub shoulders with the Lewis scholars and such, I'm not technically that. I do a lot of research related to Lewis. It's a specialty and whatnot, but I do enjoy actually the Narnia Code much more. And if one were, our listeners, if you do read both of them, you'll see that they are quite different. But I mean, they're on the same theme here. But yeah, I mean, I don't know that he necessarily thought it out. I do agree that Michael Ward, in saying that. Most people say, "Oh no, he was just going to do one book," but you can obviously see when you look back at his life and different things that he may have initially just thought of the first one, but then as he thought of what else, then the other ones came in, and because of Lewis's background in medieval literature and such, then it would be quite natural for him to have those in the back of his mind, whether he purposefully tried to set those out.
That's a really good way to put it. Well, this moonlight draws Jill out. She makes it. Well, she doesn't completely make it out of this hole yet. She's actually kind of stuck for a minute. And while she's first made it through into the overland, she sees something that is very surprising, and probably, Phil, something that you did not expect to see.
A snowball coming in at 90 miles per hour.
Exactly. A snowball hits her right in the face. She can't talk. We just need to acknowledge that she's seeing a dance in front of her after realizing that she has made it out into the heart of Narnia. And then Lewis goes on to describe this dance.
This is exactly the kind of scene that I love in a fantasy novel, where there's this tradition that's been going on for a long time and people are just loving it. And it usually involves dancing. I imagine there's quite a bit of food there too, and it just goes on for hours and hours.
Sure. Yeah, on my first read through of this chapter in preparation for this episode, I was a little taken aback. I'd forgotten about this dance from the last time I read it, and was like, why? Well, it seems weird in a place where the White Witch had made it always winter but never Christmas, that they would be celebrating snow. I would think there'd be a little bit of like, oh, snow's this weird thing. But then I forgot it's been over a thousand years.
Yeah.
That anyone connected to that time period is long gone. So for them, they're like, yeah, sure, the White Witch is a really long time ago.
Yeah, and then that reminds me of, I heard you guys discussing in an earlier podcast about people confusing or thinking that the White Witch and this Lady of the Green Kirtle could be the same person. And from what I understand is most people only get that confusion from having seen the BBC version of the series that came out in the late 80s, early 90s and such, because the same actress played the part, which you guys noted. But I don't know. There could be some people who read the books and maybe confuse them. But I think only people who have seen those films have that confusion.
Right. Yeah, and it's just hard to. It's hard not to see the commonalities between the two, I think. But it gets cleared up pretty well in this chapter that they're not the same.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
really, and I'll say this later as we get to the end, and I can just mention what he says now. Rillian says that, she must be doubtless the same kind as that white witch who had brought the great winter on Narnia long ago. So there you have it right there in the book. Rillian is saying, hey, that's a different person.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, back though to this exit from the Underland, she's taken out of this hole. The Narnians help her out. She's buried in the hole. They dig her out, and she lets them know about there's other people. So that she says there's 3 others besides the horses, and one of them is Prince Rillian. And there's a really funny part here. William, do you want to talk about this?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I really,
Yeah.
I really enjoy the humor here when Jill said just before the others were rescued, quote, "There are 3 others besides the horses, and one of them is Prince Rillian." And then near the end of the 2 paragraphs later, when there is an argument developed happening because some thought Jill was crazed, one of the animals claimed, quote, "She said Prince Rillian was a horse." So it's like, but now when you go back and look at it, depending on how how quickly you say those things, someone casually listening would kind of think that if they didn't know the whole picture for sure. For her to say it that way may be okay or whatever, but yeah, that's a good humor there.
Yeah, Lewis is really funny there. And it does say that. There are 3 others there besides the horses, and one of them is Prince Rillian. You easily could take that as, hey, one of those horses, you guys have been missing Rillian for 10 years. He's just been out, chewing on some hay the whole time. And I love that it's 2 squirrels that are arguing, because one squirrel says, no, she didn't. And the other said, yes, she did. And Jill's response is, it's quite true. She's very cold at this point. So all of this happens, and the dryads and the dwarfs, they all come and they start digging out. And that is when Eustace, the boy Eustace Clarence Scrubb, he comes through into Narnia, and I love his entrance into Narnia. Phil, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we don't see what he's doing exactly. We see what everyone else is reacting to. We hear their speech. "Now, young'un, none of that. He's a vicious one now, isn't he?" And then they do see Eustace, and he's brandishing a sword, and he's lunging at anyone who tries to come near him.
I love that. Most of this book, by the way, just hasn't actually taken place in the land of Narnia. And I love that after spending all of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader with Eustace and kind of seeing his, we can call it his conversion, right, from the last book, that his entrance into Narnia here is one that would make Reepicheep proud.
Oh yeah, for
right?
sure.
He comes out and,
Yeah, sure.
and the words that are being shouted, oh, he's a vicious one now, isn't he? Now, young'un, none of that. All those things, put that sword down. All these things being shouted by the Narnians could actually have been something they would have said to Reepicheep coming through this hole with that bravery of brandishing his sword. And I'm so proud of Eustace.
Yes.
I'm not proud of him for trying to, hurt people, but I mean, he thinks that they're enemies. So that's the good part. It's not like he did not know that these were Narnians. He's trying to protect Jill, and he's trying to protect himself. And this is such a different Eustace than we met at the beginning of the last book.
Right.
And I'm just like, again, he's just a character, but I feel I'm just proud of him.
Yeah, and I feel like he learned so much from Reepicheep, and now it's another book, and we're still getting to see that influence. It's so fun.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, yeah, very very enjoyable here.
Yeah.
I also love Puddleglum when Jill shouts down that everything's okay and they can come out. He goes, poor Pole. It's been too much for her this last bit. Turned her head. I shouldn't wonder. She's beginning to see things.
Yeah.
No one believes Jill, and that has to
That's
be annoying.
Well, then Jill and Eustace, they both get some warm drinks and they start sipping on it. after all of this, Puddleglum and Rillian are also set free. The moles and the dwarfs, they come, and they don't really mind doing this work. They quite like digging. And so
I have a question about this. Maybe you two can help me.
no, I don't like digging. So that's
You don't like digging?
Was that not the question?
No.
Okay.
What is with digging? Why do you feel? My real question is where does this this thought that dwarves love to dig, where does that come from? Because I saw that quite a bit in Tolkien's work, and I wondered if either of you knew where that might be sourced from.
I don't offhand. No. It's an interesting question.
I know that dwarves show up in Norse mythology. I know that there is also some talk, I want to say, in some like early Germanic mythology as well too. And I think just from that early mythology, you do see some of these characteristics of dwarves, right? Although we should point out that Lewis, his plural of dwarf, he keeps the F and just has dwarfs, and it's actually Tolkien who kind of popularized changing dwarf to dwarves back in The Hobbit, which is just like, it's crazy to think how big of an
impact he had.
Impact it had that almost changed a word that we use.
And quick little fun fact, they kept changing it when they printed The Lord of the Rings. They kept, well, for elves especially, they fixed it and they put it back to an F, and then he got a copy, said no, put it back to a V, and they had to go back and redo it. They it was it's so long, and there's so many like very particular things that it actually took them, I would guess, until around the late 90s, early 2000s before they had a completely correct copy.
Did not know that.
Of that.
But yeah, to just go back to answer your question, I think that's just part of traditionally what they're, smithing, all the, being underground, dwelling in the mountains kind of thing is part of just traditionally what dwarves were associated with. And that's why Tolkien and Lewis are both pulling from that. You see it in all other kinds of fantasy in the same way that, elves in fantasy might have certain things, or even fauns, right? Different aspects of what Lewis is pulling from are just traditionally part of the stories that were told about these people. So now, once Rillian comes through to Narnia, there is a lot of excitement, and that is the release of all of the tension, I feel like, of this entire book, which has been this quest book. To hear that the quest had been worth all the pains it cost is like the final exhale of we did it.
Right. Because it hasn't been easy.
No, it's been very difficult.
Oh, yeah, well, exactly. I mean, they, the first three signs, they, messed up totally. And it was only by, a weird chain of events that they were able to get the fourth one that helped save the day, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Now, as the Narnians begin talking to Rillian, Puddleglum also needs to speak up. And I just want to share a couple of the questions that he has for the Narnians. Again, he's been away for quite some time now, and it's time to, just check in, see how things have been going. And his questions are, has the king been shipwrecked? Any forest fires? No wars on the Calorman border? Or a few dragons, I shouldn't wonder. And this is a great bookend to the very first time we actually met Puddleglum, as the children were being flown over by the owls to meet Puddleglum for the first time. Remember, he kind of shows up with that lantern, and he's asking similar questions, like, "Oh, what news do you bring?" Is the king dead? All these other things, and the Puddleglum and our characters have changed in many ways, but this is one way that Puddleglum has not changed.
Yeah, he's probably one of the more consistent characters that we will ever meet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's where we get the funny line for the Narnians. Oh, just like a marshwiggle.
Yeah, all the Narnians saying that. Yeah, I love that.
Yes, that's a very good part.
Well, Phil, how does this chapter end? Because we only got a couple of paragraphs to go.
There's a feast and thing you could do right now.
What else would we do, right?
Right. You've already danced. You just kind of completed the mission. Now that you got to have a feast.
And it's here that we get that line that, doubtless the same kind of, as that white witch who had brought the Great Winter of Narnia long ago, talking about the Lady of the Green Kirtle. And kind of there is this explanation, this exposition really, just acknowledging what the Lady of the Green Kirtle's plan had been to take Rilian, to have him rule over this land. And I want to just pause here because this is deeply ironic, right? That Rilian was going to be a pawn of the Lady of the Green Kirtle in an effort to conquer a country that he actually had a rightful claim to.
Right.
Right. And I think there's a little bit of just really great Lewis storytelling in this, especially as we think about real life applications. Now, we haven't been, enchanted by a witch or anything, but a lot of times I do think there's the thing we can take from this, kind of the lesson we can take away from this, is recognizing the importance of God's ultimate providence, God's ultimate plan, right? In the fact that Rilian is able to still be like what happens when they break through here at the end of the chapter is that Rilian is king over the land, and the queen of the Underland was right that Rilian would be in charge. It's like God used her terrible plan for good. Aslan did, used her terrible plan for good, and what she wanted to happen did happen, which is Rilian became is about to become king, but it's not in any of the way that she thought it was going to happen.
Right. We also get to see that this is going to be a recurring thing. And it has been a recurring thing. The oldest dwarf says, and the lesson of all it is, Your Highness, that those northern witches always mean the same thing, but in every age they have a different plan for getting it. And in this case, the plan wasn't very good. I think the plans have had varying degrees of success in the past. This one did not work out.
Well, yeah, in terms of the plan, I was almost struggling with what this is saying here at the very end. Right now, I'm just thinking in terms of the plan is to, overtake or conquer a land that is not theirs, and to do it, any way possible.
Yeah, it seems like it's just right that it's a pretty basic plan from the witch here, just that she's going to use Rilian to kind of. And I think one thing that's unclear a little bit to me is, was she going to rule it? And Rilian would then take it over eventually, or was he really going to be the ruler, but he was more of a puppet monarch, and that the witch would be kind of directing everything that he says and does?
Yeah, I kind of take it to mean that, or the approach would be that, he being under the spell of her, that he would be the face there. She would always be behind the scenes. Unless he says, okay, here, listen to what she says, or whatever, whichever method. But yeah, I guess in some regards, either could work. But initially, I'm thinking it would be him doing the actions and proclamations, but of course, guided by what she has told him to say.
And I wonder how much the White Witch's reign in Narnia, 1,000 years before this, played into the Lady of the Green Kirtle's plan, because she is powerful, and she has strength, and she has an entire army of Earthmen to kind of take it by force and rule in the way the White Witch does, as kind of this oppressive tyrant. But instead, she almost wants to go through the more like official route of, well, Rilian's supposed to be prince, so let's go ahead and make him king, but then do it through this more subtle, seductive way of having her be in the background. And I wonder if the White Witch's failure in the past in any way did influence the Lady of the Green Kirtle. There's no way that the history of the White Witch would be lost on on her, meaning the Lady of the Green Kirtle here. And so I wonder if that idea of kind of taking it by force, seeing that didn't work in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, influenced her plan here that ultimately failed as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder how well studied she would be. And she seems to have a ton of resources, so it wouldn't surprise me if she made a plan based on what didn't work before.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and that's kind of the both the beauty and the frustration of Narnia, which is that we have absolutely no idea. We don't know really anything else about this woman than what we get in this book, in this text itself.
Right.
It remains a mystery.
Yes. Well, William, do you have any final thoughts on this chapter before we wrap up?
Well, one of the things in terms of, since this is, there's obviously one more chapter and such, but in terms of, there was the quest with the 4 signs and whatnot. In terms of just some more direct Christian parallels, some have noted that this is kind of like memorizing scripture. You have at the beginning, Aslan is giving instruction, and so we have instructions, from the Lord, and we need to best remember them, and the way to remember them is to recite them and such. And so this really, to me, keys in on in terms of the importance of memorizing scripture, so you can, have God's word in your heart to help, remind you, or to, even just on a simple level, to ground you in terms of the proper perspective to have, and to not give into the world's pressure.
Yeah, that's an excellent reminder, just to have that truth nearby in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it is one of the themes that we see often throughout this entire book, from a Christian perspective too. And I love that so many people, you included now, William, have brought that up, both guests and listeners to the show. And I think that's probably one of my biggest takeaways from reading it this time, that I'd never picked up before on any of my previous reads of this book. Well, William, before we let you go, we would both love to be able to point listeners in the direction of some more of your work, in case they'd like to follow up on some of the things you're doing. So where can listeners find you at?
Sure. Yeah. The best way to find me online would be essentialcslewis.com. And then from my website, you can also see there's some locations that I have on Facebook. I have a Facebook group that supports the website directly. Then I have some other subgroups in terms of like confirming Lewis quotes and facts about Lewis. But so the gateway would be through the essentialcslewis.com, where you can also find the podcast there on the page there on the right side. You'll see a listing of the recent podcasts that have either been released or re-released. I used to do quite a bit of shows, almost even once a week, but I slowed down to where there's primarily author interviews. And then now that I'm doing writing, I will still try to do that, but I don't do as many as I had in the past. Mm-hmm. I've done some very series. There was a reference in terms of the Narnia Code. And me speaking with Michael Ward, so you can go to the website there. And then if it's not easily found, you can just do a search for Narnia Code, and you can find that. And, I've done some interviews with others who've talked about Narnia. Several years ago, there was a book called Live Like a Narnian by Joe Rigney. I did an interview with him. Listeners might find that interesting as well. And then I did do a short series on the Narnia books, one per book, to where we did an overview about the story, some story behind the story, any background, discussion of favorite characters, unique aspects to the story, and then a general discussion of some questions that would rise out of the overall big picture of the story. So I had a couple co-hosts for that, and then a special guest that helped guide us through the book. So I'll pass on links to you that you can share in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. We're excited to be able to point listeners to more of your work. Well, finally, William, Phil and I want to thank you for all the work you did in planning the Walter Hooper tribute that aired earlier this month, or last month in January. And it was just a really wonderful thing to be able to honor all the work that Walter Hooper did, and all the work that you did as well too. We're just appreciative of, because you recorded so many of the different people who got to reflect on them. And so thank you for doing that. I know many of our listeners are also thankful for being able to hear those different episodes.
Well, you're quite welcome.
And thank you for coming on the show. It was great to meet you in person a couple of Novembers ago, and then get to have you on the show. I feel like you really brought a lot to the table, and it's been a blast.
Yeah.
Well, again, Phil, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to join in with you guys.
Appreciate it. Well, that was great having William on. I'm really glad he could make it.
It really was. We had a great time, and we're not done having fun yet.
We are not. We have listener feedback to read.
All right. Well, our email today is from Holly, and she wrote us a really great email with a lot of different thoughts on different characters and different plot points throughout this overture. And I wanted to pull a couple of things for us to talk about here. So the first one is about Jill, and she writes that she says, Jill is arguably my favorite character of the entire Chronicles besides Aslan. I think it's because I relate so strongly to her and her struggles. Imagine being pulled from all familiar surroundings, landing on the top of a mountain near the edge of a cliff, and meeting Aslan right away. I remember reading about the journey through the tunnels and Jill's crippling fear for the first time many years ago. Just reading about it made me feel terrified. I can't imagine having to crawl through dark tunnels in a different world while running away from giants that want to eat me with no idea where I'm going except farther down into complete darkness. Jill battles fear and forgetfulness throughout the Silver Chair, but she also shows incredible courage, not unlike another memorable character, referring to Puddleglum. And this part is entitled Puddleglum's Pessimism. She writes, Puddleglum is another favorite character of mine, and he's more complex than you would think when you first meet him. The Focus on the Family radio drama does a great job of building Puddleglum's character within the context of the other Marshwiggles. Ooh, I actually didn't know that. I'm excited for us. We're going to cover, I think we're getting to Silver Chair at the end of this year, maybe, on the Dancing Lawn.
It'll be soon.
Sometime. Yeah, we're in Prince Caspian right now, so... she keeps writing, Puddleglum is actually unusually optimistic or flighty compared to the rest of his kind. The fact that he was even willing to embark on this journey with Eustace and Jill in the first place speaks volumes of his courage, wisdom, and devotion to Aslan. And not only does Puddleglum have to fight against his own pessimism to follow Aslan's orders, but he also has to go against the views of his majority culture, who think that Puddleglum is already too optimistic for his own good. Man, I'm getting really excited for the radio drama now. I'm like, where all of this other drama. As you guys have mentioned, he's exactly the kind of mature, cautious companion that Eustace and Jill need, even though he isn't immune to failure and can be annoying at times. He isn't as annoying as Eustace was in Dawn Treader or the Duffel Pud. No, wait, that's my thoughts. She did not write Duffel Puds. That's just Daniel talking. That's me talking. She says, he isn't as annoying as Eustace was in the Dawn Treader before his time as a dragon, though, in my opinion. Then lastly here, the last thing I want to mention that she writes is she pulls from a work called Literary Wonderlands. And this is addressing some of the kind of hodgepodge of characters from the Chronicles. And the author of that is Laura Miller. And the quote that Holly gives us from Laura Miller says this: the medieval literature that Lewis loved and that underpinned his own work was a fusion of pagan, folkloric, and Christian elements. It's a deliberately patchwork aesthetic that seeks to collect and harmonize on the principle that all things of this world testified to the infinitely varied goodness of God. So likewise, the talking animals, northern European dwarves, classical fauns, and Arthurian knights of Narnia all happily coexist under the banner of the lion god Aslan. Does this incongruity matter? Not to millions of young readers, that's for sure. Within Narnia's elusive borders is collected every wonder that ever delighted Lewis in 1,000 of books he read, every adventure he longed for, every brave prince and doughty badger, every enchanted pool and misted mountain, every mermaid and leafy-haired dryad, every spired castle and green hill. It would be a motley collection indeed if it were not unified by the intensity of his desire. The desire to bring all of life's joys together in celebration is an impulse that even those who can't subscribe to Lewis's faith can nevertheless still understand and share. That is a really great... I'm so glad that Holly has sent over that little quote for us, because that is such a great way of encapsulating something that we've talked about since, I don't know, probably the first episode of this podcast when we met Mr. Tomness.
Right. Yeah, Holly, I really appreciate you both bringing this to our attention, but also just writing about what you're thinking and feeling with these stories so eloquently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, Holly, just thanks for mentioning that. She also she put, she had one question for you, Phil. She had a question for you. She said, you've talked quite a bit on the podcast about how different it was for Aslan to show up right at the beginning of this book. We have one chapter to go, Phil. Do you think Aslan shows up again in the book?
I do. And I think it'll be just a glimpse right at the very end.
A glimpse at the very end.
That's my thought.
And this is your prediction for the episode. That's why we didn't put it earlier. What do you think he's going to do?
All right, I think it'll be kind of he'll be at a distance, and they'll look at him, and he'll give them a knowing look, and they'll look back, and then he'll be gone.
Like, okay.
I'll also wrap it up here. This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you too can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to Elias Dean, John Marr, Emily Margaret, and Ryan Smith for supporting us at our top tiers. You can follow us into Narnia on our Twitter and Facebook pages. And if you have any feedback, email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. A review on Apple Podcasts would also be appreciated. This helps other people find the show and join our read-through. By subscribing, you can make sure the show is in your favorite podcast app, and you can wake up to a new episode every other Wednesday. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and we will be back next time with Chapter 14.